Okay, so the VBC is the control system, the element manager, the alarm aggregator for all of our probes, with the exception of the VB440. VBC currently does not integrate with the VB440 uncompressed probe. It will do, and it will do very soon, probably by the end of the year. But right now it doesn't. So I'm going to take you through a walkthrough. This is not a detailed tour of the VBC, because we will deal with that as we go through the VBC sections in subsequent training events. But right now we're going to look at some of the main menu items and what to expect from them, and then that will then lead into the more detailed training. I've just logged in. I've logged in as admin. There it is, admin. And I can log out by clicking the log out button. So I have access to all of these sites, as you can see here. Now, if I logged in as demo, so username demo, password demo, I wouldn't be able to see as many sites, nor would I be able to do any changes to the VBC, because demo is a read-only access. And this is one of the powerful features of VBC, user access control. Not only does it have user access control, but we're also able to log when people logged in and for how long. So the login time and the log out time and the IP addresses. So if something happens, if something gets changed or some error happens, then it's possible to go back through the user login history and find out who was logged in at that point. And this is one of the reasons why, for a production system, it's really important to give people personalized logins. It makes their experience and their use of the VBC better. But it also enables this audit trail to carry on. It's no good having two usernames, one called admin. It really isn't, although I have logged in as admin here. It would be far better if I gave myself administrative privileges, but my username would be Martin, for example. But we're very lazy at Bridgetech, and this is a demo system at the end of the day. But certainly in a production system, individual users should have individual login names, no generic logins. There's the first page, the login page. If we look at live, basically live is just a list of all the alarms that are current. Now you'll see this page in a couple of places on the VBC, and it looks very much like the alarm log in a probe. All the serious alarms are at the top. You cannot cancel an alarm in a probe, nor can you cancel an alarm in a VBC. The only way of getting rid of an alarm is either to change the threshold that causes the alarm, in other words, mask it somehow, or fix the problem, of course. That's the easiest way. And we can filter alarms. We can go to page 1, page 2, we can go forward a page, and so on and so forth. Now the major, or rather the landing page, if you like, when people log into the VBC is usually the monitoring menu item. This gives a nice overall view. It gives a list of our sites, it gives a list of stream groups, and then it gives a list of alarms for all sites. So it's a great landing page because it gives you an overall picture. Now I know I've said this lots of times before in all of the previous training sessions. This is a training VBC, it's a demo VBC. It's also used by development engineers. So there are a lot of alarms on this VBC, many, many, many more than you would expect to see, or certainly I would hope to see, on a production system. Sites are simply sites. I will show you a site. If we go down to the main menu, I'll keep going backwards and forwards to the main menu because this is where the configuration is done, or most of the configuration. So we look at sites and users. The first thing you notice is we've got multiple sites, and these are the sites that you saw. We've got a probe in Japan somehow, and we've called that site Tokyo. We've also got a site called VB120, and in the VB120 we have at least one VB120, for example. And when we look at the VB330, we've got a site called VB330, and inside that site are 2 probes. But I could add a test site. And now I've got a test site. So now I've got a site called test. And if I go back to monitoring, you won't actually see it there because there are no probes assigned to this site. So I'm going to go and delete those. I'm going to go and delete that test. And it's fairly simple, just delete it here. This is where you add users, by the way, as well. So you'll add a new user, just give the user a name, a password, and then the user group. And you can see we've got multiple user groups here. We'll look at those in a second. And then you can add these, so basically a blanket group of privileges. And then you can see that we can do things like show interface, show stream group, and so forth. And then we can actually say, I can see the VB330 site and the train, oops, that didn't work very well, training, and say the VB330. That's better. So I could do that, for example. And that means that this particular user, I haven't added the user yet, but this particular user would have access to only 3 sites. This is very useful because you may have a large system with multiple probes. Some of our systems have got hundreds of probes. And you may have a regional head end, for example, and that regional head end may have 6 or 7 probes. And you want the people who work at that regional head end only necessarily to see those 6 probes. You don't want them to see all of the 100 probes in the system because that can be very confusing. So this is a great way of limiting the number of sites and therefore probes that individual users can see. Now the shift leader at the regional head end, the shift leader may have access to the entire system, and that would be fairly straightforward. And user groups, basically we have there are multiple standard groups in the default VBC installation, but you can add to them and you can change them, and you can say what they can do. So I could turn admin into read only. That wouldn't make a lot of sense for the admin user, but I could do it. So I'm going to not do that. Now, blade alarms are just that. All of the alarms by blade. And by blade we mean like a VB120 or a VB220 or a VB330. So all of these appear here. But we could look at individual errors at a particular site. Well, we haven't got any on that one. So there are VB220 alarms, VB120 alarms, and so on and so forth. And we could even do further, NRK, for example. So we could actually cause the filtering to be as specific as we want it to be. So they're the blade alarms, and they are the individual alarms for the individual blades. They're not the same as the VBC alarms. Remember, we have said this before. I've said this several times in the past. Blade alarms, there are many, many blade alarms, but we don't see them at the VBC. We only see these aggregated alarms that the VBC is monitoring and putting forward. Now, the graphics view is an optional extra. It's part of the VBC, but it's an option. So you only get it if you pay for it. While I'm actually talking about licenses, I can go straight to the licenses and show you the licenses. Very similar to the probe. The license features are here, and whether they're installed or not are there. So the graphics option is in fact licensed on this probe. So going back to the graphics view, again we'll deal with the graphics view in more detail in a later training session. But effectively, it enables me as a user to use a tool like Adobe Illustrator or a product like Visio, which can design these sorts of block diagrams, and it can enable me to draw a system diagram. It doesn't have to be a system diagram. This could actually be a map of the country I'm working in, for example. And I could map my probes and my probe alarms onto areas of the country, or as you can see here, like different graphics of those particular probes. So we can see a graphical representation of our system if we wanted to, or a graphical representation of the country that my monitoring system is covering. And you can nest these diagrams. So I can go into my satellite, for example, click on my satellite antenna and look at all my satellite IRDs and monitor the streams coming out of my IRDs, for example. And if, for example, RMC here in the middle, if RMC was to cause a problem, then that alarm would map onto this particular graphic and our RMC would turn yellow or orange depending on the severity of the alarm. So it's a very powerful tool. It's not trivial to set up. It does take a while. First of all, you've got to design the graphics. Then you've got to map the alarms onto individual graphics. The alarms from individual blades and individual streams. You've got to map those onto the graphics. So it is a relatively complex process, and but once you've done it, it's there, and this is a web page and that can be seen anywhere. So we'll talk about that in more detail later. Stream view, very straightforward stream view. We've got the micro timeline. Let me make this a lot bigger. We have talked about this before. There's the micro timeline. Let me just do a refresh. So if I make the web page bigger and I refresh the page, then the page reformats to fit the maximum number of streams onto that page. And this gives you a better view. We've got the micro timeline. These oblongs, these rectangles here are micro timelines. Now, if you were to have a big enough screen, you could zoom right in and you would see that each of those micro timelines is 96 pixels wide. Those pixels represent 1 hour. So 96 pixels, 96 hours, in other words, 4 days. So each one of these ticks here are 6 hours. So 6, 12, 18, 24. The bigger ticks are a day. So if I look at 15 here, if I look at 15, I can see that we've had something about 5 hours ago, and then we've had something at 11 hours ago, and then something at 20 hours ago. So we've had errors 20 hours ago, and we've had something almost exactly 3 days ago. So this is quite a powerful tool because I can look up and down my streams and I can see, well, this has happened to the same, this has happened to multiple streams at the same time. Look, for example, at 16. We've had something about 46 hours ago. And if we look down at 23, we had something also at 46 hours ago. And if we look, let's just have a quick look. Have we got it anywhere else? Yes, also on 56 it happened. So you can see that these micro timelines give you a great view over 4 days of all of your streams. Let's make it a little bit smaller again and do a refresh. And you can see now I've got 148 streams on one page. And again, if we look over here on the right hand side, we've had some no signals about 5 hours ago. 4 or 5 hours ago, and it's happened to multiple streams, but it hasn't happened to all of the streams. So as a network engineer, I might look at these and say, yeah, these have all come from one switch. One of the switches gave me a problem 5 hours ago. So again, a powerful tool enabling you to look back in history at all of your streams over the past 4 days. And we can, because we have stream groups, we can set up stream groups. And here I go again and look at the stream groups. So I can make a stream group name. I could cause a stream group. Let's just call one training and make it available to all users. And let's just select, oh, I don't know. Let's just select these streams here, just at random. So I'm going to shift click. That didn't work. The shift click, I'm using a Mac and my shift click doesn't actually do the same as shift click does on. Okay, let's just say we're looking at those. Now we have that. So now we have a stream called training. So now when we go back to stream view, well, for a start, if we look at the monitoring view, we now have a stream group called training. There it is, training. Now I can click on that and go straight to training. Or alternatively, I could have gone to my stream group and selected training from the pull down. Remember that the default view is all streams, and then I can just select training. So now I'm just looking at my training streams. And this gives me a more detailed view of particular streams that I'm interested in. Thumbs view is a similar type of, let's go back to all streams. Thumbs view is a similar type of view, except that this time it includes a thumbnail. Now, in order to get a thumbnail, you need a VB288. The VB288 is the QoE/QoS thumbnail extractor. And it extracts thumbnails and it makes these thumbnails available to the VBC. And this is where we can see these thumbnails. We can see the thumbnails of multicast streams and OTT streams, assuming that they're not encrypted or scrambled. And we can also see, of course, the micro timeline again. We can see the micro timeline giving us a view over the last 4 days. Now, when you see thumbnails on the VBC, you'll see they've all got frames around them. And some of the frames for example, in NRK1 HD is green. But if we look at NRK Trondelag, we've got a test pattern there, obviously, but we've also got an orange frame around that. That indicates that that currently this stream has got in error. Orange, remember, is an error. Yellow is a warning, and red is a no signal. So somewhere in our system, with all of the probes that we've got, we're seeing an error, and we could go and have a look and have a look at in more detail and find out where that error is. Okay, so it's on probe number 1, but not probe number 2. So then we'd go and have a look at that in more details. So thumbs view, we've only got a few thumbnails being extracted on this particular system, which is why we're only showing 18 or so. Now, service view is another option. It's an option that allows you to look at services in an MPTS. Now, whether that MPTS comes from, say, the output of a multiplexer in an IP multicast, or maybe it's coming from a satellite transponder or a cable device. So it doesn't matter where the MPTS originates. If you have the service view option, this allows you to see the services, not the stream names. Remember, the stream names are given names in the probes themselves. So when we add a multicast stream, we give it a name. And that name could be anything. But of course, when we downlink a satellite transponder, then the service names are in that MPTS. And then they're not something that we can change. So this gives the customers the ability to monitor service name, but this is an optional extra. And again, thumbs, if there are any thumbs being decoded, we'll see them here. Map is another, actually, let me just check. I'm not sure whether it's a licensable feature or whether it's a standard feature. No, it does seem to be a standard feature. So the map is, this is a 5.5 VBC, obviously. So what I'm seeing is very ambiguous. Now, I happen to know that this is a map of Northern Europe, or should be a map of Northern Europe. I'm not entirely sure what's going on. Well, in fact, I do know what's going wrong. In order for map to work, firstly, you need to put location coordinates. Oh, there we are. We did find it. I'll explain what's happening in a minute. You must put the coordinates, the geographical coordinates of the individual probes into the equipment view. We'll have a look at that in a minute. And then when you've done that, then it appears on a map in where the geographical coordinates say that it is. And then alarms are mapped onto that particular thing. So I can actually look at one of these. So let's look at one of these, click on it. So it's a VB220. And it's an ASI with a COFDM card, and that's its IP address. Doesn't tell me much more, but it is, because it's yellow, I know there's a warning somewhere. Now, the point about one of the reasons this took so long to come up was because we need to be connected to the internet. So the VBC needs to be connected to the internet for this to work, because it needs to contact Bridgetech's map server. So obviously there was some delay in contacting the map server, and this gives a live map. So it wasn't Northern Europe at all. It was in fact the Northern Hemisphere. Now last week in the probe hidden features, we looked at the return data path. The return data path, the ability to make recordings, transport stream recordings, make them triggered or make them a manual recording or even forward them. Now basically RDP on the VBC draws all of those probes together and puts them in one menu item. So this means I can start and stop and configure all from one page. So I might have 100 probes, and rather than go to every individual probe and configure it, I can do that all from here. So that makes the management of the return data path a bit simpler. If you've got a lot of probes, you've still got to go through them, but nevertheless this is all gathered in one place to make it logistically more simple. Now the remote data wall, we're going to talk about this in a full training session, but the remote data wall basically gives it's a VBC option, and this gives the ability to look at canvases. Let's just look at one of these canvases. So we can look at a canvas, we can generate a completely new canvas, and we can do all sorts of, I'm not going to use that canvas because someone spent a lot of time designing that. So let's look at Ollie's testing. So we can do things like we can add widgets, we can move them around, we can add thumbnails, we can make them bigger or smaller. And so we've got massive flexibility on what our remote data wall looks like. So we can create an unlimited number of canvases, and each canvas can be slightly different. It works on a 10 by 10 grid, so technically you could have up to 100 thumbnails on one canvas. And then you have devices. Now devices are screens. They're either things like smart TVs, web browsers, on a tablet, on a PC, or a set-top box, something that is a smart device. And then you assign a particular canvas to a particular device, and that shows it. So we'll see that later. We'll actually, when we do the remote data wall WebEx training session, we'll go into that in a lot more detail. Equipment, again, a bit like the return data path, equipment just brings all of the probes into one place. And it gives us a whole host of abilities. So we've got all of the probes in our system. Some of them are enabled, most of them are enabled, but some aren't. So we have the bottom two, 18 and 17 probe. They're not actually, they're on the system, but they're not actually part of the VBC. So they're not part of the monitoring system, if you like. We can see what site they've been assigned to, the name of the individual probe, the type, the version of hardware. So basically all of these are version 4 hardware, and then obviously the 288 is a server based. IP address, HTTPS, HTTP, and the software version. So this gives you a nice ability just to be able to quickly look down and see where your software versions are at, and whether you need to be able to upgrade them or not, whether you need to upgrade them. So if we have any particular RF cards, you can see them all here. We can see the licenses for the individual probes. Again, don't have to go to all the probes individually. Resource and other. So if we go back to standard and just maybe add a new device, then if we the latitude and longitude, we would put that in there. So you would provide that as the latitude and longitude, and that would then, this probe would then appear on the map. So I'm going to close that, and now I'm going to delete it because I didn't want to add it. You notice that I've added a new device, and even though I closed it and didn't put anything in it, it still added it. So I want to delete that, so click on that and then delete it. So down here, down at the bottom, we've got some other little links that enable us to copy settings between devices. So between two 120s, we could copy the configuration. So things like stream list or the entire configuration. Import a configuration and keep it in a library on the VBC. Use that library to download a configuration to a particular device. And we also have a library of software versions on the VBC, and we can manage that. If we click on that, you can see here are the different software versions that are in the VBC library effectively, and we can click and we can then download those to specific probes. We can even import the software images themselves from individual probes. Alarm setup, we won't go into alarm setup particularly today because when we look at the VBC in more detail, we'll be looking at alarm setup. But I think you can see quite easily that we can select how important our alarms are. So we can actually change whether an alarm is a warning, an error, a major, or even a fatal alarm. And as you can see, there is only one fatal alarm, and that's no contact. But I could, if I wanted to, say that if I had a no signal, I would consider that to be a fatal alarm. So again, this flexibility built into the probes and the VBC to enable you to configure alarms as you see fit. We'll talk about window and reset when we look at VBC in more detail. The other thing I just want to draw your attention to are these links down here. So if I want to look at the manual, again, I've said this before and I will say it again, no doubt. VBC alarms, probe alarms, can be quite a complex subject. In fact, they are a complex subject. There's no way around this. So the manuals are really useful, and we've installed the manuals, the alarm manuals, into the VBC. So if I wanted to understand the VBC alarms, I could just click on that now, and that would give me a nice PDF that I can view. I can download that, I can print it if I wanted to. But it talks about how alarms are configured on the VBC and the alarm model. Well, in fact, it's very readable, and it's very, very useful for setting up those odd, tricky VBC alarms. This is telling us how important our alarms are. And now we can choose to forward our alarms to an email group. So do not forward. So some of them are forwarded. An OTT HTTP error is forwarded to development. What are these email groups? Well, they're here. We can set up a group, and we can put in a bunch of email. Let's just edit it. We could add a whole load of email addresses here. So, so-and-so at X, and then comma separate it and add a second email address and comma separate it and add a third email address. So this becomes a group of people like shift leaders, network engineers, development, and then you can even include a message. This is a serious network alarm. Please investigate as soon as possible, for example. And you can even add blade alarms. So that would actually add, remember the VBC alarms? VBC alarms are correlated from multiple probes. So this may even just send a single alarm. But if you click on blade alarms, then that will send all of the individual alarms from the individual blades that make up this aggregated alarm. So that would present that email recipient or recipients with multiple alarms, giving them far more detail of where these happened. Close. And SNMP traps, you can choose where to forward your SNMP for individual sites or the entire monitoring system. Scheduling, we talked about scheduling very briefly when we looked at the probes. Scheduling, and in the probes, we can schedule an alarm mask. We can look at a particular stream or group of streams, and we can say between, say, 2300 and 0600, do not forward any alarms because that service stream has gone off air. That's a probe by probe basis. But you can do the same thing with the VBC. So whereas the probe scheduling acts only on an individual probe, so the alarm from probe 1 wouldn't go to the VBC, but the alarm from probe 2 and 3 would go to the VBC. Here you can set up exactly the same type of scheduling, but this is for the whole VBC. So if I set up a schedule for Disney Kids, between 2300 and 0600, then all of the alarms from all of the probes between those hours would be masked. Timeline is another add-on feature to the VBC. I'm not going to talk about it here. It's basically an archive server that will maintain an archive of thumbnails and other data going back, I think currently it's 3 months for multiple streams. You can keep an archive of relevant data easily accessible that you can scrub up and down. This is only showing you the media window, but we could have thumbnails as well if we wanted to. And we'll look at that in more detail when we look at the timeline. Reports, again, this is a whole subject in itself, but basically we can generate reports. We can generate a manual report now of, remember, all of our streams. Remember, we even had a training group of stream list, so we can actually just see the errors on our training streams. So we can do that manually, and I can send that for the last 7 days, the last 30 days, the last 90 days, or the last 2 years if I wanted to, because the database goes back 2 years. Or I can actually generate an auto report. Daily report every day at 0001, a weekly report every Thursday, and a monthly report on every 22nd of the month. And we can email these automatically to a whole bunch of people as well. In order for you to be able to email alarms and reports, the VBC must be able to contact a mail server. Now, reports deals with IP and OTT, and extended reports deals with things like ETR 290 checks and other checks and interface checks. So just quickly looking here, we looked at sites and users, we looked at logs, and these are the logs that we can actually we can do some searches for logs, particularly if we wanted to look at logs. We can export it as XML, and I can filter as well. Settings, so to keep the history for 90 days. You can see that we're keeping our log history on this VBC for 90 days. Snapshots are really useful. Snapshots enable you to take a snapshot, funnily enough. You can take a snapshot of the VBC, in other words, the state of the VBC now. So basically, it records every condition of the VBC and stores it as a snapshot. So if I make some huge changes to the VBC, I delete a load of probes, or basically I can then reinstate that snapshot. PCs do this all the time. You know, you can if you do a software upgrade and something went wrong, you can go back to the snapshot from before the software upgrade was installed. You can do exactly the same with the VBC. Alarm statistics, just basically the ability to look at alarms over the last 4 days. Active and cleared alarms, there are just active alarms only, so we want to see when our alarms are appearing. You can see the numbers of errors, RTP drops. So again, it's a useful tool if you want to see how your alarms are trending. You can't export this data anywhere, but you can draw this and maybe take a screenshot or something like that. Stream groups, well, we saw the stream groups. This is how we make our stream groups. Service groups, exactly the same as the stream groups, except it's service orientated. The archive setup, we won't go into that until we actually look at the archive server, the timeline, and also the graphics view. We won't do that until we look at graphics view. Basically, if we need to look at authentication. So if we're doing TACACS authentication, we can select that here, and then we can set up TACACS there, the server address. Preferences, well, you can read that just as well as I can. And connections, web connections, and this is where you do your outgoing mail server. So this means this is the where you would set up a mail server in order to forward email alarms and email reports. Generally, just looking at the network. Okay, so this basically enables me to set up the network interfaces. Now, I'm not going to play around with those. If you've seen the VB288 or the software probes, you'll know these. We will deal with them later on, but any information about this is just contained in the operating manual. And then there's well, you've already seen the release information. So we're 5.506. Licenses, you've seen the license, and were we to activate a new license, it's exactly the same as a probe. Enter the new key, submit it. Technology is basically just copyright information. Credits, some of the stuff that we use from external organisations, GNU, public licenses, MIT license. So anyway, just a credit where credit's due, literally. System, so we can look at how the system's performing, make sure that all of our VBC processes are running, and if they're not, why, when did they stop? We can suspend the VBC. Basically, this means no new alarms are gathered from the probes. How much space we've got left in our subdirectories. If we need to check a server response time, we can do that. If we're having network issues, maybe slow responses, maybe check that out. There's some benchmarking going on here, and we can perform a benchmark. Support might ask you for this sort of data if you are having VBC problems. Disk tuning, I'm not going to go into all of these. They're there. Debug, very similar to the probe. Debug logs. Data. Stream groups, if we can export and import our stream groups here. And of course software, if we need to upgrade our software. So that's 50 minutes. Thanks for your time. Please feel free to take the quiz. It's a fairly straightforward quiz. This is a fairly straightforward video. Remember, you can log into the demo system, username demo, password demo, and you can go through all of these. You won't be able to go through the main. The demo is read only, so you can't see the main menu item. But you can look in the manual, look in the VBC manual, and you'll get all of that. You can watch this video again. All of the answers are in all of those places. So thank you for your time, and I hope you found this video useful. The next video in this series looks at the business partner website.